Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 in our series that we're doing on Introduction to Messianic Judaism. In the previous weeks of this class, we've been kind of setting the foundation for, for Judaism in general, of Jewish observance and Jewish practice, the holidays, life cycles, what Judaism is, like the different denominations in Judaism. Whereas this week, we're focused more on the foundations of Messianic Judaism more specifically. Not that we haven't brought a Messianic Jewish perspective into previous weeks, but now we're going to get into kind of placing Messianic Judaism within this broader context of Judaism more broadly in the history of the Jewish people. This is a quick recap. Because again, I forgot to hit record for the actual class of this. So I'm going to just do a quick recap. This is based off of the outlines, which are available from us. If you want to contact me at rabbi@simchaisrael.org, I'd be happy to send you the outlines if you're not already on our list to receive those for those who are participating in this course virtually. So as we delve into this question of the foundations of Messianic Judaism, I want to begin by looking at the definition of Messianic Judaism from the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And that's a network of congregations. Our congregation is a part of that. It's one of the primary organizations for Messianic Jewish congregations. So this is a statement that was affirmed by UMJC delegate vote in 2002, and here we go. The Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations envisions Messianic Judaism as a movement of Jewish congregations and groups committed to Yeshua the Messiah that embrace the covenantal responsibility of Jewish life and identity, rooted in Torah, expressed in tradition, and renewed and applied in the context of the New Covenant. Messianic Jewish groups may also include those from non-Jewish backgrounds who have a confirmed call to participate fully in the life and destiny of the Jewish people. We are committed to embodying this definition in our constituent congregations and in our shared institutions. So that's the end of the quote. That's the definition of Messianic Judaism from the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And there's a lot that we could unpack here, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly go through this. So what do we mean by this definition? I probably should have actually brought it up on the screen for those of you watching this. But what do we mean by this definition? Number one, we're saying that we understand Messianic Judaism as a form of Judaism within the larger Jewish world, rather than perceiving ourselves as a denomination of Christianity. We see ourselves as a denomination primarily of within the Jewish world. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't also see ourselves as part of the wider body of Messiah. At the same time, our primary community of identity, especially religiously, primarily would be the Jewish community. Number two, we acknowledge responsibility to live covenantal, faithful lives as expressed through the Torah, right? That we don't just do Torah because it's a tradition or whatever, but we believe that that all of Scripture mandates Jewish covenantal responsibility, to live a life in respect to the Torah. So the third thing is we respect and value Jewish tradition. So we are not anti-tradition. Obviously, Scripture forms the primary plumb line against which we measure everything else, but we also make decisions and guidance based on Jewish tradition. And fourth, we seek to understand our Judaism in and through the teachings of the living Torah, Yeshua the Messiah, and through the context of the New Covenant. As we've talked about many times before, this isn't just like Judaism with Yeshua faith as an afterthought, but really Yeshua and the teachings of the New Testament permeate every aspect of our Jewish life and practice and thought. Messianic Judaism is Jewish life renewed in Yeshua. a Jewish renewal movement within the larger Jewish world. As Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer states, and this is a quote, when we say that Messianic Judaism is a Judaism, we are also acknowledging the existence of other Judaisms. We do not deny their existence, their legitimacy, or their value. We do not consider ourselves the sole valid expression of Judaism, with everyone else being a counterfeit. We recognize our kinship with other Judaisms and believe that we have so much to learn from one another, as well as something of cosmic significance to share with them. That's very important. So that's the end of that quote. And so moving on, the existence of Messianic Judaism is a realization of a Yeshua-centered Judaism. There is no Messianic without the Messiah. Therefore, Yeshua must exist at the center of our Judaism, informing and infusing it with greater meaning and richness. We also recognize that not only is it possible, but preferable, even obligatory, to be both faithful Jews and faithful followers of our Messiah. As David Stern once wrote, we are both 100% Messianic and 100% Jewish. We don't have to choose between the two. Yet, as Dr. Stern also cautions, if we call ourselves Messianic Jews, we must intend to back up our words with actions demonstrating that our Jewishness has substance. Right? There's a lot of people who claim like, oh, I follow, Messianic Judaism, but what they practice doesn't resemble Judaism in one way, in any such way, other than maybe like they put on a talit, a prayer shawl, or they wear a kippah, but other than that, everything about them screams something else. Rabbi Kinzer, discussing the term Messianic Judaism, writes, quote, "It is significant that the term we selected was one which is primarily descriptive in nature, while also containing a strong claim to a unique position within the world of Judaism. Ours is a Judaism that believes that the Messiah has come and that his name is Yeshua of Nazareth," end quote. In another quote from Rav Kinzer, he writes, quote, "As Messianic Jews, we affirm two truths as central to our faith and identity. One is God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people, embodied in and guarded by the Torah. And number two, God's reconciling and revealing work for Israel and the nations in Messiah Yeshua," end quote. So from then on, there's a discussion here, and obviously this was intended to be a discussion with people in the class, but I'm just, giving you a quick recap. This is a response to often, typical questions. So the first one is, how does Messianic Judaism differ from other forms of Judaism? And so this is what's on the outline. The differences between Messianic Judaism and other forms of Judaism depend largely on the particular communities one is comparing. The Messianic movement today is quite broad and contains a spectrum of thought and lifestyles. However, the primary difference is our belief in the deity and messiahship of Yeshua of Nazareth. That's the primary difference. Another question, common question is, how does Messianic Judaism differ from Christianity? Much like the above question, the difference depends on the communities one is comparing. However, the Messianic movement can appropriately be described as a continuum, with individuals and communities falling anywhere on a spectrum between like more Christian or more Jewish, somewhere, what is the primary influence in education of the individuals? Does their identity, identification more on the Christian side of things or more on the Jewish side of things? So you can think again of the Messianic Jewish community on this, somewhere on this spectrum. This is especially true being that most of these communities approach Messianic Judaism as a hybrid. However, the Messianic Judaism we here at our congregation, Simchat Israel, and our like-minded, congregations and leaders. However, the Messianic Judaism we seek to establish is a Jewish community within a Jewish communal framework of Jewish life, thought, and Messianic understanding. Since the context of Yeshua, his disciples, and the New Testament is thoroughly Jewish, we seek to understand Yeshua from within the matrix of Jewish life and God's ongoing covenant with Israel. So although we might share similarities, especially in certain, key aspects of belief, with our Christian brothers and sisters, the way that we even approach those things that we often agree on is from an entirely different perspective and starting point. So again, as Messianic Jews, we straddle these two peoples of faith, these two covenant communities, as we're both a part of wider Israel, right? A part of the wider Jewish people, as well as we are part of this wider body of Messiah, which includes, our brothers and sisters in the Gentile Christian church. So what in this, it's intended to kind of address a lot of kind of popular things on the internet. We all cringe if you're a part of something when somebody's like, "Oh, I read about you on the internet." It's like, "Oi, I hope it was something good." In order to clarify, because I've been talking about so far about what we are, or what we seek and envision as Messianic Judaism. Now I kind of want to talk about what we are not, okay? There are certain theologies and attitudes, including some that are often falsely associated with being Messianic, which we do not share here at our synagogue. One is obviously, should be very obvious, replacement theology. The belief that Gentile disciples of Yeshua replaced the Jewish people as a new Israel, and that the Sinai covenant was replaced by a new covenant. Scripture is clear that the Jewish people remain God's covenant elect people, and Gentiles through faith are adopted into Israel, not as Jews, but as part of a commonwealth, as co-heirs in redemption and spiritual blessing. You can see this in Acts 15, Ephesians 2-3, Romans 11, and other places. So that's one, thing that we don't support. Here's another, common theology out there, which is roughly can be called one law theology. And this is in regard to covenantal observance of the Torah. One law theology teaches that Jews and Gentiles are equally covenantally obligated to follow all of the biblical commandments. This theology often promotes a universal application of Torah and makes no covenantal distinctions regarding roles and obligations. So we don't believe that. We believe that although aspects of the Torah apply to everyone who wants to be faithful to God, there are also covenantal distinctions within that between Jews and Gentiles, between the average Jewish person and somebody who is, for example, a Levite or a Cohen, who is a Levites are part of the Levitical tribe, and the Kohanim are those who are of priestly descent, who still have there's still practices for the Kohanim in Judaism. Another sort of common theology out on the internet is something that can either be called two-house theology or Messianic Israel or Messianic Israelite theology. This is actually sort of very similar to like a lot of Black Hebrew or Israelite theology. Not all, because there's actually, even within that, there's quite a spectrum. But two-house theology or Messianic Israel theology is a belief that Christians are really the genealogical descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and that Jews are only from the tribe of Judah. It interprets itself as the restoration of all Israel. Ultimately, it is another form of replacement theology, right? To believe that basically Christians are just, as covenantally obligated in everything as Jews are, because they're the real Israelites. And often the reason why this is a replacement theology not only is that ultimately it displaces the identity of the Jewish people, because, since there are more, there are 10 tribes rather than just one tribe of Judah, that therefore they outnumber and therefore are more important than the Jews. It's a form of replacement theology. So another thing that we are not is we are not anti-rabbinic tradition. Which is the outright rejection, dismissal, or devaluing of rabbinic Judaism and tradition. Advocates of this position argue Jewish tradition is nothing more than the inventions of men who rejected Jesus. It's an overly simplistic perspective and is usually motivated by one of these other theologies, replacement theology, and often a combination of some of these. So in a way, and not only is our synagogue and our understanding of Messianic Judaism and those congregations that kind of align with us are not anti-rabbinic tradition, even though we see ourselves as a form of Judaism, we are not anti-church. This is the overly critical or entirely dismissive attitudes towards the historic church or various perceptions that Messianic Judaism is a replacement for pagan Christianity. Like, not that there aren't some legitimate critiques, but we are not anti-church. We see ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, as a part of the wider body of Messiah. At the same time, we are also, part of wider Israel and have the people of Israel and have covenantal responsibilities as Jews and as a Jewish community. Another kind of common thing that you'll encounter on the internet is what could be called sacred name theology. This is the belief that one must use God's Hebrew name, what's called the tetragrammaton in theological language, when praying or writing or speaking about God. Advocates often claim they are correcting the Jewish error of using circumlocutions. Sorry, my tongue is not cooperating today. Of circumlocutions in reference to God. A clear indicator of this theology are speculative and wild claims about knowing God's or Yeshua's true, real name that nobody else knows, like some kind of secret knowledge. So this could include, secret names or pronunciations like Yahshua, Yahuwah, Yahusha, Yahshua, all kinds of like weird stuff. And most of the time, this is from people who have no clue about Hebrew or the rules of Hebrew, right? They just have some invented theology and try to make language fit their theology rather than the opposite. So the other thing that we are not, again, if this isn't familiar to you, that's fine. But if you are, familiar with Googling Messianic Judaism online, another thing that you might encounter is this idea, which I'll just simply label alternate calendars, meaning the rejection of the traditional Jewish calendar for determining festivals and holy days in favor of alternative and supposedly more correct lunar or solar calendars. The idea is that, the Jewish, the Jews got it wrong, and so we're going to give you the real biblical calendar. Yeah, well, we don't follow that either. The last thing that I'll just mention for now is dual covenant theology. This is also something that we are not, is a belief that Judaism and Christianity have their own distinct yet equal covenantal pathways to salvation. Therefore, Jews don't need to believe in Yeshua. Even though this is a complicated discussion and this isn't the place to get into the details of that, we don't believe that. We do believe and want other Jews to recognize that Yeshua really is the Jewish Messiah, even if we understand that in, there's some important discussions there, but we don't hold a theology that basically these are two, Judaism and Christianity are distinct entities and they each have their own sort of pathways to God. Yes, but also no, right? Anyway, so it's really important that we define, because for a lot of people out there who are not familiar with halakha of Jewish law, it's a terrible way to interpret halakha. It really means, Jewish life or Jewish living, how to be Jewish. It's important to, especially in a world where kind of people just make up their own rules about, if I feel something or if I identify as something, therefore it must be true. Judaism is like other tribal peoples, is matters of identity are determined by the group, not by the individual. This is true of, for example, indigenous tribal groups and others who understand things on a much more corporate level than just simply leaving it up to each individual. So even though you would think this is obvious question or an obvious answer, for the sake of, because it's important to at least define these things, I want to just give you a definition for what is a Messianic Jew, right? Seems obvious, but for many it's actually not. So according to us, A Messianic Jew is a person of Jewish heritage, meaning they're born to either a Jewish mother and or a Jewish father, or who has gone through a formal conversion to Judaism, who remains committed to the social and religious values of Judaism and the Jewish people, and believes that Yeshua of Nazareth is the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. So in our understanding of a Messianic Jew, and for example, there are many kinds of Jewish Christians, and I'll address this in a moment, but when we define what a Messianic Jew is, that number one, they have to, be Jewish in the sense of like, that your father and or mother are Jewish, that or converted to Judaism. Number two, you remain committed to the social and religious values of Judaism and the Jewish people, and you believe that Yeshua is the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, right? Like that's what makes a Messianic Jew. According to the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, of which I currently serve as president, this is our definition as a part of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. So, quote, following the consensus of Jewish tradition, we recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish mother or who is a convert to Judaism. We also recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother if that person has undertaken public and formal acts of identification with the Jewish faith and people. For reasons I'm not going to get into here, but if anything that I say, if you're interested, please feel free to email me, rabbi@simchaisrael.org. If you have questions on any of this, but essentially the definition of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, for the sake of recognizing, historically for the last 1,800 years or so since the time of the Mishnah, Judaism has primarily been passed down matrilineally. Biblically, it was patrilineal for all kinds of reasons that have to do with like war and, the Romans raping Jewish women and stuff like this. Historical context led to a transition to identify Jewish identity through the mother. So anyway, because of recognizing the historic practice of Judaism for the last 1,800-ish years, we favor matrilineal descent, but we also, in certain circumstances, recognize patrilineal descent as well. So on a halachic note, just kind of unpacking this a little more, this does not include those who recently discovered a distant Jewish family member within their ancestry. To be considered Jewish, one needs to be a part of the ongoing chain of continuous Jewish life. Therefore, a person of distant Jewish descent needs to go through a public and formal act of re-identification through conversion to be considered Jewish. This also includes descendants of conversos whose families were forced to convert to Christianity in Spain or elsewhere in Europe in past centuries. For more about this, please speak to a rabbi. Okay, so, we might even welcome you as like, hey, we recognize a legitimate descendant of Jewish people, but that's not the same thing as being Jewish, right? And so in order to be regarded and seen and included as a Jew, you need to, if there are any questions or ambiguity in your Jewish status, you should speak to a competent rabbi. So this then leads to an often asked question. Therefore, are all Jews who believe in Jesus Messianic Jews? Because this happens a lot. People who are not hold to some of the values that I mentioned earlier, who will call themselves Messianic Jews. Like, that's fine, but this is our understanding. There are many types of Jews who actually believe in Jesus, believe it or not. Jewish Christians, Hebrew Catholics, Jews for Jesus, etc. However, Messianic Jews specifically envision our primary spiritual and communal reference as Jewish. Therefore, a Jew who converts and assimilates into Christianity and loses any meaningful affiliation with Jewish identity may still be Jewish, but is not a Messianic Jew because they have chosen, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to make the Christian world and culture their primary reference of identity, not Judaism and the Jewish people, right? This isn't the place to put a value judgment on that. It's just simply distinction, right? Distinction in the sense of like sometimes distinction is necessary. And in this case, we don't mean that every kind of Jew who believes in Jesus is necessarily a Messianic Jew in the way that we understand that, okay? As Messianic Jews, we fundamentally believe that Jews are obligated to remain Jews and live covenant faithful lives within the Jewish community, in obedience to our unique relationship with God through the redemption of Yeshua the Messiah. We also do not seek to convert other Jews away from Judaism. As a form of Judaism, we desire to see Jews who have left their Jewishness return to Judaism and live covenant faithful lives. From our perspective, faith in the Jewish Messiah should lead us to a greater sense of Jewish identity within the larger Jewish world, not away from it. If Yeshua really is the Messiah, then it should lead Jews to become better Jews. And I realize that's a broad understanding, and I'm not, going to unpack the details of what that could look like, because there's going to be disagreement exactly. So the last thing that I want to do is just kind of touch on, because Messianic Judaism also attracts, not only because of intermarriage, but just interest from many Gentiles, usually Christians, who are interested in understanding the New Testament and Yeshua faith from a Jewish perspective. And so, many congregations have Gentiles, Gentile Christians in them. So I want to first say that in our congregation, we welcome and include those from non-Jewish backgrounds who are called to support and participate in the life and destiny of the Jewish people. We believe in this sense of mutual blessing, that Christians and Jews have a lot to learn from one another. That ultimately Jews and Christians must come together ultimately for the return of our Messiah. There's a lot we could unpack. So Gentiles within Messianic Judaism obviously need to have cultural sensitivity in the way that they are a part of the community, of recognizing that they're in some ways guests, especially when you're a new visitor. You're a guest in Jewish space, right? And it's not your job to dictate the vision of the congregation. You either share the vision and want to participate in that, or you don't. And if you don't, that's totally fine. There are wonderful churches out there that you can attend, but a Messianic synagogue might not be the best place for you. It's really important that you understand that the Jewish people as a people are a cultural people, and that you might feel a little out of place when you visit a synagogue, and that's okay. Doesn't mean you're not welcome or whatever, but there needs to be a sense of, and aspects of cultural sensitivity in the way that you are included. The other thing is that the sense of recognizing some covenantal distinctions. There's certain ritual privileges which identify the person participating in them as a member of the people of Israel. So although we, welcome participation of everybody, at the same time there are certain things where there needs to be a distinction, not because we want to be, in most cases nobody even really realizes that, that they're even Jews and Gentiles within the congregation, but there are certain rituals in which, and again, these are usually exceptions. So these would include Brit Milah on the 8th day of Bris, 8th day by a moil, is really, that's reserved for Jews. What's called Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn, in a Jewish manner. Bar Bat Mitzvah is something that we believe, is only for those who are Jewish. A Jewish wedding, and I don't mean that Gentiles cannot, maybe have some Jewish aspects of a wedding or some symbolism included, especially if they're a part of a Messianic Jewish congregation. But I will not officiate the exact same marriage ceremony that I would for Jews if I was asked, for example, to do that for two people who were not Jewish. Even in a case of an intermarriage, there's at least one thing that is slightly different that I do in the case of an intermarriage. For, again, it's covenantal reasons, because it has to do with the language of what is being said intends a specific thing. It's not just like a generic tradition. The other thing is death and burial according to specifically Jewish practices. Not that, I have obviously officiated for an intermarried individual, or even for in some cases where the person was not Jewish, but I didn't do a Jewish funeral for them. I did it either if they were intermarried in a part of our synagogue, then maybe I would include some Jewish tradition into it, but I wouldn't do the exact same thing, especially for somebody who is not Jewish and not intermarried. Some other halachic considerations is a friend of mine, Boaz Michael with First Fruits of Zion, they often talk about the sign commandments. Like there are certain things, like there are many commandments in the Bible that Gentiles are free to take on if they would like. However, there are certain, just a handful of commandments that are called sign commandments, meaning that the whole reason they're given, and the Torah even says, is this is a sign between the covenant between me and Israel, right? They're specifically intended to be a sign of the covenant. So therefore it would not be good for somebody who's not a member of that covenant to do something, right? Many people who are married go wear a wedding ring, right? However, it'd probably be a little, it's a little not quite kosher if you were to wear my wedding ring, right? You know what I mean? Because that becomes symbolic of the sign between the covenant that was made between my wife and I, right? You wear any other wedding ring, you can do whatever, you have your own relationships, right? But to take on mine would sort of be a little inappropriate because you were not a party to that covenant between us. It's probably not a great example, but it'll have to work. All right, so here's what my friend Boaz Michael says, quote, "Not all the commandments that apply to Jews equally apply to Gentiles. This means that Gentile believers who have not taken on those commandments of the Torah that do not pertain to them specifically as Gentiles are not wallowing in sin or rebelling against God." Meaning, like, you're free to take on these, some of these other commandments. You're welcome to do so. But because of certain covenantal distinctions, you are not in sin by not doing it, okay? Now, you might feel blessed, and even led by God to do these things, but it's different. For a Jew to not do them is technically in sin for not doing them. They might be missing out on the disciplines and godly intentions of these commandments, which bring great structure and blessing to one's life, but they are not living in defiance or rebellion towards God. Gentile Christians are not, in fact, obligated to all of the commandments in the same way that Jewish people are. So again, he's not saying that Gentiles are not obligated to the Torah in any way whatsoever. It's just understanding, the way that the Torah applies. And by the way, even if you're Jewish, it doesn't apply equally to everyone. Like I mentioned earlier, Levites and those who are Kohanim, like who are descendants of like the priests, or between men and women, or there are laws that only apply if you live in the land of Israel. So, for example, agricultural laws. You could be Farmer Joe in the Midwest and want to, for example, observe Shemitah, like letting your ground rest every 7 years, or, some of these agricultural laws. You can do that, and you might even, God may bless you in that, but you're not obligated to do so. It only applies in the land of Israel. It's only required inside the land of Israel. So anyway, my point is that not all of the mitzvot even apply equally to everyone at every single time and in every single circumstance, right? And most of the commandments in the Torah actually cannot even be observed today. Most of the commandments in the Torah actually have to do with the temple, its service, and the offering of sacrifices and offerings. And since those cannot be observed today, they aren't obligatory right now or binding on anyone without a temple and without a temple structure. So just let me finish this quote. I keep going on a little rabbit trails, but to finish the quote, to be fair to Boaz Michael, he says, "The apostles chose not to obligate Gentile believers to certain sign commandments and specific markers of Jewish identity, which were enjoined specifically upon the physical nation of Israel, the Jewish people. Therefore, circumcision, Shabbat, festivals, mezuzah, tefillin, tzitzit, kashrut, and the Levitical functions." So those are specifically between God and the Jewish people. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't observe Shabbat, because there are places in the prophets, for example, in Isaiah, where it talks about a blessing on the Gentile who chooses to observe Shabbat. Like, that's a blessing. But you are not obligated to do so the way that Jews are, because for Gentiles, it is not a sign. So in the Torah, it says both, that Shabbat serves as a remembrance of creation, right? Because God rested on the seventh day. At the same time, it also says, Oti Leolam. It is a sign forever between God and Israel, right? That it serves as a covenantal sign. So for Gentiles, it doesn't serve as a covenantal sign, but it does serve as a blessing and a reminder of creation. So there are certain things in which, can be observed to a degree by Christians, by really not just your average Christian, but like Gentiles in a Messianic synagogue in appropriate ways, but other things should not. Again, for example, like a talit, because the whole point, according to Numbers 15, is, first of all, it's commanded to Israel, to Israelites, right? It says, speak to the children, to the Israelites, and tell them, put tzitzit on the corners of their garments. Why? So that they will look upon them and remember the commandments of the Lord that were given to them and to observe them, right? It's covenantal. It's not just for everyone. It's specifically one of those sign commandments between God and the Jewish people. The other thing that I just want to, close in mentioning is that there's certain ethical considerations that should also be taken. It is completely inappropriate. Sometimes people just make assumptions. That's fine. But you don't want to ever lead anyone to, you cannot, it's completely unethical and immoral to identify or lead people to believe that you're Jewish. So for example, a Messianic Gentile should not, especially if they were to go into like a conservative or reform or any other kind of a synagogue and tell them you're Jewish and be counted in a minyan, for example. That would be completely unethical. And it's a problem. So in the way that Gentiles participate in wider Jewish life should be done in culturally appropriate and ethical ways. There are ways to be fully included as a Jew through, for example, through conversion. But there's a proper vehicle for that. Again, speak to a rabbi, a competent rabbi. If you have any other questions, I'm more than happy to as best as I can to interact and to discuss things with you. Again, you can reach me at rabbi@simchaisrael.org. Okay, take care. Have a great whatever. All right, thanks.